you, Dr. Qamar Al Huda. What we have seen, how the America is looking. We have seen the tariff wars, the tariffs which the Americans implemented, and then there were retaliatory tariffs from Canada, and again retaliatory tariffs from United States, and then we listen from the United EU, European Union. I was listening to the EU Commission President. She was talking about era of rearmament for the Europe, and they are building some $800 billion for their defense. And then we are seeing that there is a global realignment. So how do you see, while sitting in the United States, that how the American strategic community is looking these developments, and how the society is looking, Dr. Qamar?
Thank you. Most appreciate those kind words of introduction. What we're seeing in the foreign policy analytical world and in the strategic studies world is something that is unique in its history, which is, if we just took a macro look of the past 80 years since post-World War II, just a macro, it has been a world divided between the U.S. And world power, and then, of course, then the Soviet Union. And then most of the states had to assign or partner up within these two powers, right? And then, of course, there's the non-aligned movement. But in the past 80 years, the world has been organized, and sort of the power has been distributed through these two great thinking. And then within this time was the establishment of the liberal order, the order of partnerships, the order of international organizations, and the world of multilateralism, or the rule of law, etc. And in it, these institutions were used to organize the powers of those two great powers, the Soviet Union or the U.S. Now, after the Cold War, I'm just taking a big picture because this is what was being discussed here in the security studies world. That the post-Cold War of multipolar, then you had, of course, the U.S., Russia, and China, and the rising influence of India and other states too with BRICS. So what we're seeing is a real, not just a challenge to global order, is a challenge to the liberal order, the challenge of partnerships, the challenge of the way things have been done, which actually cost these powers a great deal of their own resources. And so President Trump belongs to not only a particular wing within the Republican Party that sees that this liberal order has cost and expended too many resources as being a leader in this global affairs. And now it's time to reorganize the world where you still can maintain leadership, still can move away from this binary thinking that Russia is the global threat to all Western interests. And China is also a threat to a point where we need to expend all of our resources to diminish its rise or its influence. So what is happening is a seismic change for the U.S. foreign policy, because it's telling its partners, its Western allies, as we saw what happened in Munich Security Conference, and before that at Davos, we had American senior leaders, vice presidents, and an NSC advisor, Mr. Waltz, all speaking about how Europe has to refocus. Its enemy is not Russia. Its enemy is not Russia. Its enemy is its own self in its problems in freedom of speech and not enhancing its own institutions. Sort of like a very tap on the wrist and saying you need to realign your own priorities. And the U.S. is not going to pay for Europe's security. You will have to do your own security. And as we've seen, as a first example of this is what happened last week with President Zelensky coming to the White House. Big drama. He was berated. And then within 48 hours, we have the Europeans stepping up close to $6 to $7 billion in military aid. U.S. stopped military aid to Ukraine. And this is just an example of this shift. There's many, many things that I think are to come. And then yesterday, the President Trump announced in his speech that he received already a letter of agreement for the mineral agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine, and also for upcoming ceasefire. So what we see is a very interesting many levels of a negotiation, many different perspectives in conflict resolution, at the same time of the shift of U.S. leadership in the global order. And the global order needs to, one, the partners need to take care of their own security concerns, need to put in more funds for their own security, and also at the same time, when there's a trade imbalance, they also need to make sure the U.S. is not, according to this current administration, is not being exploited in terms of a trade balance. And so they were tariffing its own closest allies, our two countries bordering the U.S., Mexico and Canada, but also China and 25 other close allies. So what we've seen is what I would call a seismic change in the foreign policy and domestic policy. And this is really important. And how it relates to South Asia and to Pakistan, we can discuss that. But I do think that the European partners are just awakening. And after Macron's visit, Prime Minister's visits from UK and of course Canadians, after all these visits, they're just realizing, although most of this was already promoted and during the campaign, much of it is written in what we call 2025 strategy on how to do foreign policy and domestic policy, how to realign priorities. All this was laid out in the past year. But I think many of these partners are just realizing it now, the March 5th, just realizing the 6th of what is the reality of this new partnership with the United States.
So do you think, you have just given an overview of the entire situation. Dr. Qamar, do you see that this transatlantic alliance is falling somewhere? And what kind of a world the Americans will see if this transatlantic alliance collapse? For instance, we just heard that the Americans have stopped giving aid, and just right now when we are speaking, we heard that the Americans have stopped sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians. So do you think if the transatlantic alliance falls, do you think that the America will no more be the superpower?
Yeah. What is happening, I think the transatlantic partnership with the U.S., we're seeing a realignment of priorities and values, where the U.S. is dictating and determining what these things are. It's not going to be traditional, where the U.S. will constantly pay the many things that it leads, whether it be in NATO, whether it leads in other security partnerships or any other economic concept. So the most important thing, I think we haven't said, or it's not very clear in the global political analysis, is that this Trump administration has said repeatedly that when the European alignment came together, EU specifically, they saw that as a direct threat to the American economics and American banking industry and also trade. So they actually see the EU as a threat, and they want to recalculate how to work with the EU, but not waiting for what the EU will do. So when you calculate your closest partners, and especially the way they organize themselves as the EU, and as everyone knows by now, that EU was a project coming out of World War II, but it took at least 3 decades to come together, 4 decades or more. But the point of it is that there's been backlashes with Brexit. And other right-wing movements within Europe. And so the U.S. is capitalizing on this. The administration is capitalizing on this inner tensions in Europe, as well as the schisms within how EU can respond very slowly and is inefficient with its own bureaucracy. And because of this, and you can see this an example of the Ukraine war, how slow they were dependent on moving on this, and how they've been slow on many, many things. So this administration wants to capitalize on that while maintaining its some partnerships, but not taking the lead in terms of its expenses in this transatlantic relationship.
Well, may I come in here?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
When Donald Trump announced his national security policy in his first term, December 2017, he said that major power strategic competition with China and Russia would be the top most national security policy. Europe was nowhere on the scene. It was presumed that transatlantic alliance will continue, But this time around, he has actually started with Europe. You hear very little about China except for the tariffs. Other than that, we don't see much rhetoric about South China Sea or Taiwan Strait or things of this sort. He's hell focused on Europe, and the Europeans get it. Now, Europeans, there are two sides to it, which I want to then pose you a question. One is, in my view, Ukraine war will not continue anymore. Europeans cannot afford to sustain this war on behalf of Ukraine. I don't think they can afford it because bulk was being borne by the US. And secondly, Europe will now have to cough out much more for their own security, which will take a long time. I mean, it won't happen. So some in Europe are thinking that perhaps they should just wait out these 3 years of Trump era, because he is not representing the mainstream. His supporters were annoyed with globalization, with internationalism, because they thought that it was taking away, this process was taking away their jobs. So it's a temporary phenomenon which will go away. So many in Europe would probably wait it out, but at the same time keep spending, increasing their spending on their militaries. So my question would be, is based on these observations, that do you think that transatlantic alliance is dead now, or do you think that it's only a few strains will probably go away with time?
It's an excellent question, Ambassador Saab. I would just say that for those who believe that this transatlantic is just a little blimp, it's a 4-year administration and they'll wait it out, I think that's a miscalculation, because what we see is a new rise of this type of thinking within the political party, not only the Republican Party, but of course, look at the rise of his vice president, Mr. J.D. Vance, who's gone to Europe, who's expressed these sentiments and is going to express this new policy. And we have to remember that even if Donald Trump only lasts 4 years, J.D. Vance can come for 8 years, right, if he is elected as president. So this will be a period of 12 years with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance's 2 terms. So this is a possibility. It's a strong scenario. And it all depends on many, many domestic factors, of course. The elections in the U.S. are not determined by foreign policy. It's usually determined by domestic economic issues and security issues, domestic issues. But foreign policy and the removal and moving back from globalization, there is a group very supportive of this within, of course, Republican Party, but outside the mainstream U.S. society, that it's been costing the U.S. a great deal amount. It's taking so much investment, time, energy. It's also a lack of focus on U.S. infrastructure and U.S. needs and priorities. So this is not just a random thought. These are underlying values we're seeing and expressed on daily newspapers and on the news. The U.S., I don't have the percentage, but this has been growing since I would say since the first war of Afghanistan and Iraq, was an overcommitment to global issues, an overcommitment to overseas concerns, and driving domestic at the expense of domestic issues. But on the issue of transatlantic, I think there's some that will wait it out, but I think those who are doing it at the expense of what all these sort of repercussions that will happen in this time. This is the man and team that's very much committed to transactional politics, is also tied to something called integrative bargaining. The pie is, this is the winners and this is the losers in this bargaining deal. And they do not want to lose in any bargaining, any negotiations. And also, there's a new realignment that Russia could be a partner in Middle East security and energy and other sorts of sectors, tech, instead of being a competitor and as they use the word, demonized. And they're not an enemy. This is the terms that the Republicans are saying. This shift with this new Russian-American alliance is really important to acknowledge. And I think the Europeans should see this pretty fast.
Well,